A small cafe where everyone holds their breath as soon as one man steps through the door. A millionaire so feared that silence follows him like a shadow. But one day a young waitress dares to break the silence, and what happens next changes everything. Stay with us because what begins with fear ends with an unforgettable transformation. The mornings in our cafe were usually filled with the small, ordinary sounds that comforted me. The hiss of the espresso machine, the light clatter of cups stacked on trays, the uneven rhythm of the old ceiling fan. People came in with tired faces and heavy bags, their voices soft, their steps slow, as if the cafe itself was a place where they could breathe before facing the noise of the city. But on that particular morning, all those familiar sounds died the moment the door opened and Maxwell Grayson walked in. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. I felt it, the hush that spread through the room like a sudden draft, the way conversations broke in half mid-sentence, the way every head tilted slightly downward. The smell of roasted beans and warm croissants suddenly felt sharper, almost bitter, as if the air itself resented his presence. I tightened my grip on the coffee pot I was holding, my hand trembling just enough to remind me that fear had a way of making itself known even when I tried to hide it. Maxwell Grayson didn't rush. He never rushed. His footsteps were measured, arrogant in their slowness, as though the entire room was his to command. A tall man in an immaculate dark suit, his hair silver at the temples but his eyes sharp and cold. He carried the kind of wealth that forced people to step aside without a word. He wasn't a regular in the usual sense. He didn't come for comfort or routine. He came because he enjoyed watching people shrink in his presence. The barista beside me, Lucas, dropped a spoon on the counter when Maxwell approached. The metallic clink echoed too loudly in the silence, and I saw Lucas pale as if he had committed a crime. Even the customers seemed to hold their breath. A young couple in the corner stopped whispering, their coffee untouched. An elderly woman clutched her handbag closer, staring into her cup as if she could disappear into it. I told myself to keep moving, to keep pouring coffee, to keep my smile fixed the way I always did. But I couldn't help glancing at Maxwell as he slid into his usual seat by the window. His presence altered the room itself. The sunlight that fell through the glass seemed colder around him, the chatter outside muffled, as though the cafe had been placed under glass and he was the one controlling the silence. I wanted to believe he didn't notice how everyone stiffened, how hands shook when they set his plate down, how voices dropped when they spoke near him. But of course he noticed. That was why he came. I had seen it in his eyes before, the quiet satisfaction of a man who fed on other people's unease. And though I told myself I had nothing to fear, after all, I was only a waitress, invisible, unimportant, I still felt the weight of his gaze pressing down on me even when he wasn't looking. That morning, as I moved between tables with the tray balanced in my hand, I sensed something more than the usual tension. It wasn't only fear, it was expectation. As if the whole cafe was waiting for something to happen, something that none of us could name but all of us dreaded. I caught Lucas's eye behind the counter. He shook his head slightly, already bracing for what would come. And in that heavy silence, as the city outside went on with its careless rush, I realized that our cafe was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a stage, and Maxwell Grayson had just taken his seat in the front row. I didn't know it then, but that morning would be the last time we allowed him to control the script. I had worked in the cafe for nearly 3 years, and in that time I had seen customers of every kind: lonely students who stretched out a single cup of coffee for hours, hurried businessmen tapping their fingers against laptops, mothers trying to calm children with muffins still warm from the oven. But there was no one like Maxwell Grayson. He didn't come for coffee or breakfast. He came for the performance of power. And every morning that he chose to appear, he turned our cafe into his theater of cruelty. He began with the smallest things. The cup wasn't warm enough, the saucer wasn't aligned with the handle, the foam on his cappuccino was too thick or too thin. His voice was not raised but sharp, cutting with the precision of a knife that needed no volume to wound. That morning, Lucas carried the cup to his table, hands steady though I could see the tension in his shoulders. Maxwell lifted it, examined it for less than a second, then set it back down with deliberate force. "Did I not say yesterday," he murmured, his tone quiet but cold enough for everyone nearby to hear, "that I detest coffee served at this temperature? Too hot and it scalds. Too cold and it insults the beans. Do you imagine I'm paying for mediocrity?" Lucas stammered, his lips trembling as he whispered an apology. I watched his throat tighten, his eyes lowering in a way that made me ache. He wasn't just a barista to me. He was a kind boy who always offered me the first croissant from the morning batch, who shared stories of his younger brother's school plays, who worked 2 shifts a day to pay his mother's medical bills. To see him reduced to silence by a man who sipped cruelty as if it were wine filled me with a heaviness I could not shake. But Maxwell didn't stop there. He leaned back in his chair, his voice rising just enough to ensure the entire room could hear. It amazes me how this place survives at all. Perhaps customers come for the comedy of watching staff stumble over basic service. Tell me, Lucas, is it your ambition to ruin coffee for every soul in this city, or only for me? The word stung more deeply than any shout could have. People shifted in their seats, some pretending not to listen, others staring into their cups with guilt etched across their faces. No one spoke. No one ever spoke. We all had too much to lose: jobs, reputations, fragile peace. And Maxwell knew it. He fed on our silence. I tried to focus on my own tasks, clearing plates, wiping tables, pretending I was invisible, but every sound in the cafe seemed muted by his presence. I could hear the scrape of his spoon against porcelain, the deliberate sighs he released to punctuate his disappointment, the tapping of his fingers on the glass, as though counting down the moments until someone failed him again. When Lucas returned with another cup, his hands shook so much that a drop of coffee slipped over the rim and onto the saucer. I saw it happen in slow motion, the way Maxwell's eyes narrowed, the pause before the corner of his mouth curved upward in a smile that held no warmth. "Ah," he said softly, almost amused. "And now you serve it like a child spilling milk. Do you enjoy embarrassing yourself? Or is incompetence simply your natural state?" Lucas's face flushed scarlet. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched painfully, heavy and humiliating, until Maxwell chuckled and waved a dismissive hand. "Go. Try again. Perhaps the third attempt will reach the standard of a street vendor." I stood frozen, my tray pressed against my hip, my nails digging into the wood. I wanted to move, to speak, to shield Lucas from the sting of those words. But fear kept me rooted. I knew what everyone else knew, that to defy Maxwell Grayson was to invite ruin. He had the wealth and the connections to make people disappear from jobs, from opportunities, from entire neighborhoods. Yet as I watched Lucas retreat behind the counter, his head bowed, something inside me shifted. I remembered my mother's voice from years ago, telling me that dignity was not something others gave you. It was something you refused to surrender. I had never forgotten those words, but I had buried them, the way one buries seeds in hard soil, waiting for a moment when the earth finally cracks open. That morning, as Maxwell sipped his coffee and the cafe sank deeper into silence, I felt the first fracture in the ground beneath me. There are mornings when the present feels unbearable, and the only place I can escape to is memory. That day, after watching Lucas nearly collapse under Maxwell's cruel words, I felt myself slipping back into another world. My own childhood. A world as far from polished suits and expensive watches as one could imagine. We lived in a narrow apartment at the end of a forgotten street, the kind of place where wallpaper peeled like tired skin and water pipes coughed before they ran. My mother worked double shifts at the laundry, and yet somehow she always managed to leave me a warm bowl of oatmeal on the table before I walked to school. I remember her hands more than anything else, red from detergent, rough from scrubbing, yet steady when they held mine. She used to say that money was something you could lose overnight, but dignity was stitched into your skin if you protected it. "Anna," she would whisper when she caught me lowering my head in front of richer children, "never let anyone make you believe you are less. The moment you bow to humiliation, you give them more than power, you give them your soul. And the soul is not for sale." Those words shaped me, even if life often forced me to swallow them. At school I was the girl with patched clothes and shoes that squeaked when it rained. Children laughed. Teachers looked at me with pity that cut deeper than cruelty. But every evening my mother sat beside me, brushing my hair back as if I were a queen and not a girl who counted coins for pencils. "Stand tall," she said, "even when the world wants you to bend." It wasn't easy. I learned early that dignity doesn't protect you from hunger, and pride doesn't pay the bills. There were nights when I heard her crying softly behind the bathroom door. and mornings when she forced a smile that fooled neither of us. Still, she never let go of her lesson. I remember one particular afternoon when our landlord mocked her for being late on rent. His voice dripped with contempt as he suggested she find a wealthier man to marry instead of working herself to exhaustion. She stood there, tired and pale, but her eyes did not waver. "I'd rather clean your sheets for the rest of my life than sell my daughter's respect for bread," she said. And somehow, in that moment, I saw what true strength looked like. Years later, after she passed, I carried those words with me like a shield, though I often doubted my ability to wield it. Working in the cafe was not a dream. It was survival. And survival sometimes demands silence. I told myself it was better to endure humiliation than to risk my job. Better to let Maxwell's cruelty roll off me than to challenge it. After all, bills had to be paid, rent had to be met, and fear had a way of disguising itself as practicality. But as I stood behind the counter that morning, watching Lucas tremble as he prepared Maxwell's coffee for the third time, I felt my mother's voice stirring inside me like an ember refusing to die. She would not have bowed her head. She would not have let silence justify cruelty. And though I had spent years telling myself that I was too small to resist, I realized that the lesson she had carved into me was still there, waiting. I thought of her worn shoes, her weary smile, the way she faced down men with more money and more power without ever lowering her eyes. And I wondered, what would she say if she saw me now? Would she tell me to stay quiet, to protect what little I had? Or would she remind me that dignity is worth more than any paycheck? The answer was already in me. It had been there since childhood, written into the rhythm of her voice, etched into the memory of her hands. And as Maxwell raised his cup with that same cold satisfaction, humiliating Lucas once again, I felt the old shield finally pressing against my chest, urging me to lift it. I didn't know then how dangerous a choice it would be. I only knew that silence had never been my mother's way, and perhaps finally it could no longer be mine. The day stretched on, heavy with the echo of Maxwell's insults, yet the cafe did not return to its usual rhythm. Even after he left, silence seemed to cling to the walls, and Lucas kept his eyes lowered as if ashamed of something that had never been his fault. Customers whispered quietly, pretending not to notice the tension, but every one of us had felt it, the sting of a man who used wealth like a whip. I wiped the counter again and again, my hands restless, my chest tight, and with every motion my mother's words echoed louder. Dignity is not for sale. Stand tall. Never bow. I tried to push them aside. What good would standing tall do against a man like Maxwell? He had money, lawyers, connections. I had only an apron and the certainty that if I angered him, I would lose my job before the day was over. I told myself that silence was survival, that keeping my head down was the only way to protect myself. But then I looked at Lucas, his face pale, his hands trembling as he arranged cups with exaggerated care, and I knew silence was not protection. It was complicity. The next morning Maxwell returned. He always returned. His presence arrived before he did. The way customers stiffened, the way the staff exchanged glances, bracing themselves for what was inevitable. I watched Lucas prepare his coffee, measuring the temperature twice, wiping the saucer 3 times, desperation written into every movement. He carried it to Maxwell's table with the care of a man holding his own heart in his hands. Maxwell didn't even glance at him. He sipped once, set the cup down, and spoke with a voice dripping in disdain. "Better," he said, "but still lacking. You lack refinement, boy. Do you know what refinement is? It is the difference between being tolerated and being respected. You will never rise above your station if you cannot master even this." The words fell like stones into the silence. Lucas muttered an apology, but his voice cracked. He turned quickly, retreating to the counter, his dignity trailing behind him like a shadow. And in that moment something in me broke. I felt it like a surge rising from my chest, a force greater than fear. My hands trembled not with anxiety but with resolve. I saw my mother standing in the doorway of our tiny apartment, her tired face fierce as she told a landlord she would never bow. I heard her whisper, "Stand tall, Anna. Never bow." And for the first time in years I understood that those words were not advice. They were a command. I glanced around the cafe. My colleagues avoided my eyes, their fear written plainly on their faces. Customers lowered their gazes, pretending to be absorbed in newspapers or phones, but I could feel their unease, their silent agreement that Maxwell was untouchable. And yet I knew I could not watch Lucas be torn apart again while I hid behind silence. My feet moved before my mind had fully caught up. I set down the tray, smoothed my apron, and walked toward Maxwell's table. Each step felt like a drumbeat in my chest. Fear clawed at me, whispering that I was about to destroy everything. But another voice, stronger, whispered back, "Dignity is not for sale." When I reached his table, Maxwell looked up with a lazy smile, surprised to see me standing before him. "Yes?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Another server come to test my patience?" My voice trembled at first, but I forced it steady. "No, Mr. Grayson. I came to say that you have no right to humiliate people here. Not Lucas. Not anyone." The cafe froze. Forks paused midair. Cups stopped halfway to lips, and even the old ceiling fan seemed to hush its weary hum. My words hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous, daring to exist. Maxwell's smile faltered. He studied me, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether I was foolish or brave. "And who are you?" he asked softly. "To lecture me on rights?" For the first time I didn't lower my gaze. My heart pounded but my chin lifted. "I am someone who refuses to bow." The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever felt. It was thick, electric, waiting for something to break. My colleagues watched in horror, the customers in awe, and Lucas stood frozen behind the counter, his face pale with disbelief. I had crossed a line no one had dared to cross before. And though fear pressed hard against my chest, I knew I would not step back. The moment the words left my mouth, the cafe seemed to stop breathing. I could feel every gaze on me, from the customers clutching their cups to the staff frozen in place behind the counter. The air was thick with shock, as though no one believed they had actually heard what I said. Yet there I was, standing at Maxwell Grayson's table, my voice still echoing in the silence, my body trembling but upright. Maxwell leaned back slowly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the handle of the porcelain cup. His eyes, cold and sharp, roamed over me with the precision of a man dissecting a puzzle. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but it was not amusement. It was the smile of a predator who had found a new target. "So," he said at last, his voice low, almost silky, "the little waitress has decided to grow a spine." His words carried across the cafe, making people shift uneasily in their seats. "Tell me, girl, do you understand what you've just done?" I swallowed hard, my palms damp against the fabric of my apron. Fear screamed inside me to turn around, to apologize, to retreat back into invisibility. But another voice, the one that had carried me here, kept me steady. "I understand enough," I replied, my tone firm though my knees shook beneath me. "I understand that you have no right to humiliate people simply because you can. We serve you coffee, Mr. Grayson. We are not here to serve your pride." Gasps rippled through the room. I caught sight of Lucas, his eyes wide with both terror and awe. My colleagues stood frozen, as if rooted to the spot by fear that even being near me would condemn them too. But there was no turning back now. The shield my mother had given me, her lesson of dignity, stood between me and Maxwell's gaze, and I clung to it as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Maxwell's smile deepened, though it carried no warmth. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice dropping lower but sharper, every word slicing like a blade. "You mistake your position, child. You think courage makes you equal to me? Courage is nothing without consequence. And consequence, I promise you, is something I command." I felt my breath catch, but I did not look away. "Then command what you will," I said softly, though my chest pounded. "You cannot command my silence." The cafe erupted with whispers. Some customers tried to mask their curiosity behind lifted newspapers or half-empty cups, but their eyes betrayed them. They were watching a duel none of them had expected. A duel between wealth and defiance. Maxwell's expression hardened. He lifted his cup, sipped calmly, and set it down with deliberate slowness, as though giving himself time to savor the moment. Then he spoke, his tone dripping with contempt. "Do you know what happens to people who stand against me? They disappear. They lose jobs, homes, futures. I have destroyed men twice your age with a single phone call. And you, a girl in a faded uniform, dare to tell me what I cannot do?" Every word pressed against me like a weight, but I held his gaze. My voice trembled, but I forced it into steadiness. Maybe I don't have wealth or power or connections, but I have something you can't take away. I have my dignity, and I will not let you strip it from me, nor from Lucas, nor from anyone else who works here. A hush fell over the room so deep I could hear the hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter. Maxwell stared at me, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing as though measuring just how far he could break me. I braced myself for his reply, knowing it would not be mercy but fury. Yet beneath the fear, something inside me felt strangely calm. For the first time I had spoken the truth aloud, and no matter what came next I would not regret it. Maxwell leaned back again, his hand gripping the arm of his chair. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but it carried an edge that cut even deeper. "Very well," he said. "If you wish to play the hero, I will make certain your name becomes a warning. Let us see how long your dignity lasts when the world itself turns against you." His words were a threat, but I no longer felt like a shadow cowering under his presence. I stood straighter, my chin lifted, my hands steady at my sides. For the first time I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not respect, but something closer to unease. The cafe remained suspended in silence, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. My heart pounded with the certainty that this confrontation was far from over. Maxwell would not let it end here. He would strike harder, sharper, more personal. And I knew I was ready to face it. The silence after my words was almost unbearable. For a moment I thought Maxwell would simply stand and leave, but men like him never retreat so easily. They strike, and when their first blow doesn't land, they dig deeper, searching for the wound you try hardest to hide. I watched his eyes narrow and I knew he wasn't going to humiliate Lucas anymore. He was coming for me. He leaned back in his chair, one arm stretched along the polished wood as if he owned not only the cafe but every soul inside it. His voice dropped into something softer, sharper, each word chosen to cut. "Dignity," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the word. "A fine speech from a girl like you. Tell me, where did you learn such lofty ideals? Certainly not in this uniform." He let his gaze travel deliberately over me, making sure every person in the room followed his eyes. "No, I imagine you learned it in the dirt, the way rats learn to gnaw through scraps." The room stiffened. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I refused to lower my eyes. He wasn't finished. "Perhaps you'd like me to remind these good people of where you come from," he continued, his tone laced with mockery. "A neighborhood no one dares walk through after dark, buildings crumbling like the people inside them, fathers drunk before noon, mothers slaving themselves into graves, children with shoes falling apart on their feet. That is your legacy, isn't it, Waitress? A broken past, a life steeped in poverty. And now you stand before me as if your words carry weight. Tell me, who are you to challenge a man who built empires when you come from ruins?" The words landed like blows. For a moment my throat tightened, and the faces around me blurred. He had named the very truth I had worked so hard to bury. My childhood was not a secret, but it was a wound. One I had kept hidden behind careful smiles and steady work. And now here he was, dragging it into the light for everyone to see, reducing me to the girl with patched clothes and a mother who worked herself into exhaustion. I gripped the edge of the table, my nails pressing into the wood, steadying myself. I could hear whispers ripple across the cafe, could feel the customers' eyes flickering between us. Some pitied me, others feared for me, but no one spoke. That silence was Maxwell's greatest weapon. He thrived on the quiet of witnesses too afraid to stand. For a heartbeat, I wanted to sink into that silence too. I wanted to step back, to let the weight of his words crush me. But then, somewhere beneath the shame, I felt the memory of my mother's voice. I remembered the day she stood in front of our landlord, her body weary but her eyes fierce, telling him she would never sell her daughter's respect for bread. If she had found strength in the midst of despair, how could I abandon mine now? I raised my chin. My voice trembled at first, but I forced each word to steady itself against the storm. "Yes," I said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I grew up in a poor neighborhood. My mother worked herself to the bone so I could stand here today. And maybe I don't have marble floors or golden spoons, but I have something your empire has never taught you. respect. You cannot shame me with my past, Mr. Grayson. My past is the reason I will never let men like you strip me of my dignity. The cafe erupted into stunned silence. Maxwell's eyes flashed with fury, his composure cracking for the first time. He leaned forward sharply, his voice now hard, stripped of its calm mask. You think your pitiful speech changes anything? You are nothing. You will always be nothing. The world is built by men like me, and it is suffered by people like you. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might break free from my chest. But I did not look away. Then maybe it's time the world stopped suffering, I whispered. Something shifted in the room then. A current of energy I hadn't expected. I saw heads lift, eyes meeting mine instead of lowering. The silence was no longer empty, it was waiting, heavy with the possibility of breaking. And I realized that though Maxwell's words had been meant to destroy me, they had opened something larger. He had revealed not just my past, but his fear, that a girl from the ruins could stand before him without bowing. I had survived his attempt to break me, but the battle was not mine alone anymore. For a long trembling moment, I thought I had reached the end of my strength. Maxwell's words still echoed in my chest like bruises, and though I stood upright, I felt the weight of every stare pressing on me. The silence was unbearable, and I was certain that once again everyone would bow their heads, sip their coffee, and let cruelty rule the room. But then I heard the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. It was a small sound, yet in that frozen cafe it thundered like a drum. An elderly man, Henry, one of our regulars who had been coming every morning for years, rose slowly to his feet. He was frail, his shoulders bent with age, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his table for support. But his eyes, when he lifted them to Maxwell, were steady. Enough, Henry said. His voice low but filled with the kind of weight only truth can carry. You've had your sport, Grayson. You've humiliated the boy, you've tried to break the girl, and still you sit there as if you own the air we breathe. But you don't. Not here. Not today. The words rippled through the cafe, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Henry had always been quiet, always content with his tea and a newspaper folded neatly at his side. To hear him speak now, to hear him defy the man everyone feared, was like watching a candle flame grow into a torch. Maxwell's head turned sharply toward him, his lips curling into disdain. And who are you, old man? He sneered. To challenge me. You can barely stand, and yet you think your opinion matters? Henry's hands shook, but his voice did not. I matter because I am here. I matter because I see what you are doing. And I matter because silence is the weapon you've always used. Not today. Not while I still have breath. Something broke in the room then. It was as though his courage had pulled a thread no one dared to touch, and suddenly the entire fabric of fear began to unravel. A woman at a nearby table set down her cup and spoke clearly, her voice quivering but firm. He's right. We've all watched you belittle them day after day. We've all been too afraid to speak. But it ends now. Another voice joined in, a young man in a business suit who had been scribbling notes into a laptop. You think you're powerful because no one resists. But look around you, Grayson. No one here respects you. They only fear you. And fear is not the same as respect. Maxwell's jaw tightened. His eyes darted around the cafe as more voices rose, one after another, like a chorus that had been waiting to be heard. I come here for peace, not to watch people humiliated. You've treated these workers like dirt for too long. This place belongs to all of us, not to you. The air shifted. For the first time since I had known him, Maxwell Grayson no longer commanded the room. He sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers curled tightly around the porcelain cup as though it could anchor him against the tide rising around him. I felt tears burn the corners of my eyes, but I held them back. This was not sorrow, it was something fiercer. Relief. Gratitude. Power. I had stood alone, and for a moment I believed I would be crushed. But now, one by one, others were standing with me. Henry took a shaky step closer, his hand resting briefly on my arm as if to lend me his strength. You were right, child, he whispered. Dignity is not for sale. And no man, no matter how rich, can strip it from you if you refuse to surrender it. The cafe was no longer silent. It buzzed with the low hum of defiance, with whispers turning into voices, with fear dissolving into something stronger. For the first time I saw Maxwell falter. His eyes flickered, not with rage alone, but with something he had never shown before: unease. And I knew then that the tide had turned. The air inside the cafe no longer felt suffocating. It vibrated with a new energy, the kind I had never dared to hope for. Henry still stood beside me, his fragile hand trembling on my arm, but his voice had lit something in everyone present. For the first time, the customers were not shrinking under Maxwell's shadow. They were lifting their heads, allowing anger to replace fear. It was subtle at first: the tightening of jaws, the rustling of papers cast aside, the scraping of chairs as people leaned forward. But then the voices began to gather, one after another, a tide building against the man who had ruled this place with silence. Maxwell's gaze swept the room. His lips curved in a mocking smile, but I saw the stiffness in his posture, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table. He was not used to resistance. He was not used to being anything other than untouchable. "So," he drawled, his voice sharp, "the rats find their voices at last. Do you imagine your words carry weight against me? Do you think your little protest matters?" His contempt only fueled the fire. A woman near the window stood, her face flushed. "We matter because we are here, and we are not afraid of you anymore." Another man followed, lifting his cup high as if in a toast. "Respect cannot be bought, Grayson, and you've run out of it in this place." Murmurs rose to agreement, spreading like sparks across dry ground until the cafe was alive with defiance. I stood in the center of it, my knees weak, my chest pounding, but my voice steadier than it had ever been. "You don't belong here, Mr. Grayson. This cafe has survived without your cruelty, and it will continue to survive without your shadow." His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I thought he would lash out with the same venom he had used against Lucas, against me, against anyone who dared defy him. But his words caught in his throat as more customers rose, their voices intertwining with mine. "Leave. Go find somewhere else to spread your poison. We won't watch you tear people apart anymore." The sound was deafening, not in volume but in unity. The very silence he had once commanded had turned against him, filled now with voices refusing to bow. Maxwell pushed back his chair violently, the legs scraping against the wooden floor with a screech. He stood tall, his suit impeccable, his silver hair gleaming in the light, but the power he carried seemed to drain from him. For the first time he looked small, not in stature but in spirit. He reached for his coat with a jerking motion, his pride unraveling with every second that passed. "You will regret this," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "All of you. Do you think you can shame me? Do you know who I am?" Henry's voice answered, quiet but firm, steady as stone. "Yes, we know exactly who you are. That is why we will not let you stay." The room fell into a heavy silence, but this time it was not Maxwell's silence, it was ours. The silence of people who had spoken their truth and no longer feared the consequences. Maxwell glanced around one last time, searching for submission in the faces he had always controlled. He found none. Only resistance, only calm defiance. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and then with a sudden motion, he turned and strode to the door. The bell above it chimed as he shoved it open, the sound oddly triumphant. He did not look back. When the door closed behind him, the cafe seemed to exhale. Chairs creaked, cups clinked, and voices rose, not in fear but in relief. Lucas stumbled out from behind the counter, his face pale but his eyes shining. He whispered, "Anna, you did it. You truly did it." I shook my head slowly. "No. We did it. All of us. Even Henry." Henry chuckled, though his voice cracked. "I only reminded you what you already knew, child. Sometimes one voice is enough to open the door, but it takes many to hold it wide." Laughter and applause filled the room, soft at first, then stronger, until the cafe felt transformed. The same walls, the same tables, the same old ceiling fan, but a new spirit breathed through them. For once, we were not shadows shrinking under Maxwell Grayson's power. We were people standing tall. And yet, as the relief washed over me, I felt a strange unease. Maxwell had left humiliated, but men like him did not forget humiliation. They carried it like a blade, waiting for the chance to strike back. The morning after Maxwell stormed out of the cafe, the air felt different. For the first time in years, we moved without the invisible chains of his presence. Lucas whistled under his breath while preparing the espresso machine, the sound clumsy but full of relief. Customers entered with lighter steps, and I noticed how their voices didn't shrink to whispers as they had before. The silence that Maxwell had commanded was gone, replaced with a warmth that felt almost fragile, as though we were all afraid to disturb the new balance we had created. And yet, beneath that comfort, my thoughts were restless. I kept waiting for the door to slam open, for his polished shoes to strike the floor with that arrogant rhythm, for his voice to slice through us again. Fear had carved itself too deeply into my memory to vanish in a single day. When the morning passed without him, we exchanged glances, half grateful, half cautious. Perhaps humiliation had driven him to seek another place to assert his dominance. Perhaps we were finally free. But on the third day he returned. The moment the bell above the door chimed, every motion in the cafe froze. I looked up, bracing myself for the same cold arrogance. But Maxwell did not enter with the same thunderous presence. His steps were slower, his posture less rigid, as if some invisible weight pressed down on him. He wore the same immaculate suit, but his eyes no longer carried that sharp gleam of satisfaction. Instead, they flickered across the room uneasily, as if searching for something he could not name. No one moved to greet him. The customers who had once bowed their heads now kept their gazes steady, watching him openly. Even Lucas straightened behind the counter, his hands firm as he set down a steaming pot. For a long moment the tension was unbearable. Then Maxwell walked quietly to his usual table by the window and sat down. He did not demand. He did not criticize. He simply folded his hands, his gaze drifting to the street outside. When Lucas brought him a cup, his fingers trembled slightly as he placed it down, but Maxwell only nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. The cafe exhaled as one. I stared at him, unable to reconcile this subdued figure with the tyrant who had once ruled us. Was this another performance, a trick meant to lull us before he struck again? Or had humiliation cracked something deeper inside him? For days he returned, always quieter, always more reserved. He stopped insulting Lucas. He no longer corrected the angle of the spoon or the warmth of the cup. Sometimes he sat in silence, staring at the steam rising from his coffee as though it carried secrets he could not grasp. Other times he opened a notebook, scribbling with a distracted hand. The staff whispered about it in the kitchen. Some thought he was plotting revenge, others that he was sick, his pride wounded beyond repair. But I sensed something else. I had seen the way his mask slipped when the customers rose against him, the way his power drained as he left the cafe in disgrace. I recognized the emptiness in his eyes because I had once carried it myself, the emptiness of realizing that wealth and control cannot silence the truth forever. One afternoon, as I cleared a nearby table, he spoke without lifting his gaze. "You think me a monster," he murmured. His voice startled me, not because of its sharpness but because of its fragility. "Perhaps you're right. But do you know what it feels like to sit in a room and realize no one respects you, that they only endure you?" I froze, the tray heavy in my hands. For a moment I saw not the tyrant but a man stripped bare. I wanted to answer but no words came. Before I could gather myself, he added softly, "Your words that day, they haven't left me." He fell silent after that, his eyes fixed once more on the street, as if the world outside could provide him answers. When I returned to the counter, Lucas asked what he had said. I shook my head, unwilling to share. Not because I wished to protect Maxwell, but because I didn't understand it myself. Yet as the days passed, I realized something undeniable. The man who had once thrived on our fear was changing. Whether it was humility, regret, or simply the loneliness of defeat, I did not know. But a seed had been planted in him the day we stood against his cruelty. And though seeds grow slowly, they cannot be ignored once they take root. The morning of his change began like any other. I arrived early, the streets still damp with last night's rain. The cafe filled with the comforting scent of freshly ground beans and baked bread. I tied my apron, wiped the counter, and tried to still the strange restlessness in my chest. Maxwell had been returning daily, subdued and quieter than I ever imagined possible. Yet something about him unsettled me even more than his cruelty had. The silence of a man who seemed to be carrying words too heavy to speak. That day, he arrived later than usual. The bell above the door chimed, and every head lifted. Conversations paused, spoons stilled in cups. He walked in alone as always, but this time he did not head directly to his table. Instead, he stopped in the center of the room. His eyes swept across us. Not cold, not piercing, but hesitant, almost uncertain. For the first time since I had known him, Maxwell Grayson looked human. The silence was unbearable. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the faint hiss of the espresso machine behind me. Customers waited, the staff froze, all of us bracing for some new cruelty or calculated remark. But what came next no one expected. Maxwell cleared his throat, his voice unsteady at first. "I owe you all something," he said. The words were quiet, but in that silence they struck like thunder. For years I believed that money gave me the right to demand, to belittle, to control. I wore my wealth like armor, and I thought fear was respect. But 2 weeks ago in this very place you showed me I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the cafe. Maxwell never admitted fault. The idea of him standing there acknowledging weakness seemed almost impossible. Yet he went on. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, setting them on the nearest table like a man discarding something heavy. "I humiliated Lucas," he said, his gaze flickering toward the counter. "I treated him as if he were less than human, when in truth it was I who was diminished. I mocked this cafe, this staff, and even those who sat here quietly, as though your presence existed only to feed my arrogance. And when Anna stood against me," his eyes met mine then, steady but filled with something raw, "I tried to break her too. I failed. Because what she carried was stronger than my cruelty." My throat tightened, my hands shaking against the tray I held. To hear my name on his lips in front of everyone, to hear him admit what he had done, was almost too much to take in. Around me, customers shifted, leaning closer, as if afraid to miss a single word. Maxwell drew in a breath, his voice firmer now. "I cannot erase the things I said. But I can tell you that since that day, I have not been able to forget them." Her words, Henry's courage, your silence breaking into defiance. It was the first time in years I have seen myself clearly. And I did not like the man I saw. The cafe was still, every face turned toward him, waiting. Maxwell's shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time he seemed smaller, not because of defeat but because of honesty. "So today," he said, "I want to do what I should have done long ago. I want to apologize. To Lucas, to Anna, to every member of this staff, and to every one of you who sat here and endured my arrogance. I was wrong, and I am sorry." For a moment no one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, fragile, waiting to see if they would break. Lucas was the first to move. He stepped out from behind the counter, his voice unsteady but clear. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," he whispered. "But thank you." Applause began slowly, a few hesitant claps from the back of the room, then growing stronger as others joined. Soon the cafe was filled with the sound of hands striking together, not out of obligation but out of relief, out of recognition that something extraordinary had happened. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. Maxwell looked at me once more, his eyes not pleading but steady. "Anna," he said softly, "you reminded me that dignity cannot be bought. I will never forget it." Tears pricked my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I only nodded, my voice trembling as I answered. "Respect is all anyone asks, Mr. Grayson. If you've learned that, then maybe something good came from all this." The applause swelled, filling every corner of the cafe. The air was lighter, freer, as if a storm had finally passed. Maxwell lowered his head slightly, almost a bow, then turned and left the cafe quietly. But this time his departure did not feel like retreat. Felt like the first step of something new. When the door closed behind him, Henry leaned toward me with a faint smile. "You see, child? Sometimes even the proudest men can change. But only when someone dares to stand." I looked around the cafe, the staff, the customers, Lucas smiling faintly through tears, and I understood. This was not just about Maxwell. It was about all of us, about the power of a single voice refusing to bow, about how dignity, once spoken aloud, can awaken even the most silent hearts. And as I stood there, the sound of applause still echoing in my ears, I realized something my mother had always tried to teach me. True strength is not measured in wealth or fear. It is measured in respect.